Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 8 of Reappropriate the podcast. I'm really excited today to have as my guest Cayden Mak of 18 Million Rising, and today we're going to be talking about digital activism as decolonial projects, which is a little bit of a play off of a couple of essays that have been written lately about Twitter as a decolonial project with radical origins, written by Sui Park. I really want to talk about some of the ideas that are there in that article, as well as a couple of other essays, and really just sort of focused on questions that are raised in regards to digital tools and social justice organizing. So like I said, I have invited with me today my very special guest, Cayden Mak of 18 Million Rising. And Cayden, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm the new media director at 18MR, where I build technology, hack technology together, lurk on the internet, and otherwise, use the internet as a tool for organizing for Asian American racial justice.
And you totally undersell yourself, Cayden, because I think of you and 18 Million Rising as like social media digital wizards when it comes to Asian American organizing online. I mean, you use the internet in ways that are creative and just really outside of the box, and that's part of the reason I keep inviting you on. Like, I think last month I had you on as a guest, and we were going to actually talk about the topic of tonight, but we never got there because we really sort of focused on identity formation as it relates to online spaces. So I don't want you to undersell yourself. Today, what I really want you to talk about is how we can integrate the digital world with our activism, more specifically the digital part.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I feel like this is actually something that I have always thought about a lot. And if you all had tuned into the last episode I was on, we talked a lot about like my origin story as a queer brown kid on the internet. But I think that it's still kind of magical to me that like my day job is to like figure out ways to actually build technology at this point that allows us to do meaningful activism. But yeah, it's the best.
Well, and like I said, I think what's really fascinating about what 18 Million Rising is doing, and why I keep bringing you on to talk about this, is that I think, virtually every week you guys are unrolling a new way that you're using online tools, many of which I think, Cayden, you are developing specifically, or at least helping to integrate and bring new ways to sort of integrate not real world, but like offline activities with the online world. So something that just happened yesterday or today is you guys unrolled this voter registration Rock the Vote campaign called #OurVoteMatters, and you're looking for Asian American, or I think all website partners with that, and Reappropriate actually just partnered with 18 Million Rising. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that campaign and what you're doing with it? Because I think it's really cool.
Oh yeah, this is kind of we did this in 2012 with Rock the Vote as well, where basically what we're doing is, so Rock the Vote has this really great online voter registration tool, and at this point it's actually fully integrated with the online voter registration portals for 3 states. So you can actually complete, if you forget which states it is, it's like California, Nevada, and something other.
I don't know.
There's information somewhere about that, but you can actually complete your entire voter registration right there in the internet, which is awesome. There are some other ones that you have to go off-site. There are a couple that you have to like still print out the damn thing and mail it in. It is. I will also say that today is a voter registration deadline for a couple of states, and it's like Texas and Arizona are really important ones. So if anybody tuning in lives in those states, like, while you're listening to us, fill the damn voter registration cards and that thing in.
Go ahead. I was going to say, if you're trying to... I was going to say, if you're trying to figure out, if you're listening right now and you're trying to figure out how to do that, you can actually go to vote.18mr.org, which is the sort of hub site for the #OurVoteMatters campaign. Or as a partner, as a new partner, you can also go to reappropriate.co, and you can go in the upper right-hand corner the upper right-hand sidebar has a little button that says Rock the Vote, and when you click on that, it's actually very cool, and this is why I really love it. You click on it, and it pops open a little window, and you pick your state, and depending on which state you pick on, it will give you the information for what you need to do to register to vote. And as Cayden pointed out, the Texas and the Arizona voter registration deadlines are today, and those are two states with really large and growing, I think some of the fastest growing Asian American populations in the country, and yet nationally our voter turnout rates are super low. So when I got this email from 18MR about this campaign, I was really psyched because I figured this was a way to integrate what I do with voter registration issues, which is sort of an on-the-ground, perpetual campaign that we need to be working on as a community.
Yeah, totally. Oh, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Florida, and Georgia. You live in those states. Register like literally now. I will like.
Don't turn us off.
Especially if you're in one of those Eastern time zone states, man, your time is ticking.
Don't turn off the podcast, but if you're listening to the podcast, open another window and go do it right now. So that reminds me that now that we've sort of gotten the ball rolling a little bit, I just want to remind any listeners who are listening right now that you can participate in the podcast in a couple of different ways. Today we're going to be talking about #activism, and even though it's Cayden and I talking, we really want to encourage user participation. So if you are listening, you can participate by tweeting questions to @Reappropriate, and as I get them, I will read them on air, and we will hopefully answer them. Alternatively, if you're live streaming through Google Hangout, you can interact with us using the question and answer app, and we can see those questions as they come in, and we will be able to respond to them. So just to kick off, we talked a little bit about your 18MR's voter registration campaign and tool, and it's one of several ways that I think social justice organizers are using the internet in really creative ways to create new frontiers of organizing and activism. And recently, I think just today, Cayden, 18MR linked an article from youngest.org in which Youngest wrote, quote, "Young leaders are developing action plans devoid of permission or mainstream media's attention to them. In Ferguson, nonprofit organizations are collaborating and shaping the culture around modern-day civil rights organizing via social media." And I think I really liked this quote because I felt like it just pulled out exactly how we're using the internet in really unique ways to try and bring attention to social justice issues, just like you're doing with voter registration. And I think one of the great examples we touched on a little bit last time, and I'd like to touch on a little bit today, is the ongoing protests in Ferguson. I think last time we talked a little bit about how Twitter was this great tool for bringing the entire nation's attention to Ferguson. And I wonder if maybe you have any thoughts now that we're a month and a half to almost 2 months in, how Twitter has really been influential in shaping how the Ferguson protests came to our mindset and how it's shaped how we perceive the issue.
Well, I think one thing has become, continues to become clear about the role of Twitter in a lot of sort of locally hot protest movements is that without Twitter, we wouldn't know what the fuck is going on.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that there were over 1,000 tweets or 1 million tweets about Ferguson before CNN and the media picked it up is evidence of this. That this continues to be the primary way by which we can get information fast enough to build a meaningful response. And I think that one of the exciting things about right now is that there are the velocity at which these things are moving is, I think, without the internet, there wouldn't be this sort of feeling of interconnectedness between things. I think the speed at which these things are happening is not insignificant, and is actually a major sort of infrastructural change to the way that we do organizing.
Yeah, and you're right that the speed with which we could get news about what was happening on the ground was really striking. Within minutes of something happening on a sidewalk, those pictures could be tweeted to the entire world, and we could see what was happening. Human rights organizations sent people to watch what was happening in Ferguson. But I feel like we all kind of had that role a little bit. We were all sort of watching and monitoring and engaging in that protest despite economic and geographic boundaries that would say that we couldn't physically be in those spaces. We could participate and show solidarity, but also raise awareness and do our part to sort of be there and protest, even if it was in sort of a Twitter neighborhood rather than in the actual offline neighborhoods in Ferguson. And I thought that was really cool. But one of the words that you picked up on that I really like is the term interconnectedness, and I sort of want to transition us from Ferguson, which has sort of been talked a lot about lately, and I actually really want to draw a connection to what's going on in Hong Kong right now with the Occupy Central movement, and particularly in terms of how I think the internet has managed to create a bridge between the Ferguson protests and the Occupy Central protests in a way that just last week we saw pictures from Ferguson of people tweeting solidarity to the Hong Kong protesters. And we also saw how the Hong Kong protesters were inspired by the activities in Ferguson. Do you think that would have happened if we didn't have the internet?
Well, I just don't think there would necessarily be the, I guess, volume, visibility, and speed of that kind of turnaround, right? Like, one of the ways in which social media has played a major role in a lot of recent protest movements is the fact that regular people have gotten to sort of pick and filter their own iconic imagery of, I guess, the iconic imagery that stands for what they're fighting for, right? And because of that ability of like regular people to sort of intervene in the this like cultural layer of images, it's become. What am I trying to say? I mean, in the past, like the arbiters of iconic images have been, mass media publications. Now, because tens of thousands of people might retweet what becomes an iconic image, it's not necessarily just the sort of information gatekeepers who get to choose those images that move us, right? And I think that property of Twitter that allows us to be the arbiters of what we take to be iconic moving images is a really powerful thing. Seeing, I especially am thinking about the image of the black woman in front of the line of police on her knees with her hands up. To me, that's like a profoundly iconic image, and that's the kind of thing that you would hope to see in Life magazine. But
go ahead.
From regular people on the ground, right?
Right. Actually, I really like that point. It's something I hadn't really thought about. It's an interesting connection you're making that's sort of arising in my brain right now, so hopefully this doesn't come out garbled. But back when I was a high school student and I was studying art a little bit more, we had conversations about how the art world chooses what art is. It was the idea of how art critics are sort of the gatekeepers to what we consider art, and with more mainstreaming of art, you had a movement away from the art critics being sort of the deciders of what makes great art, to sort of a democratization where just anybody could provide input and judge art. And so it no longer became this pastime of the elite. It was something that everybody could take ownership of and engage in. And when it comes to journalism, I think that you have similar sorts of things happening here with Twitter and with other digital tools, where rather than having these editors or what would be these art critics decide what is newsworthy or what is good art, now we get to have that power to judge what is the right way that we want to represent reality and represent truth. And so I was reading this article in Slate, I want to say, or maybe The Atlantic, I don't quite remember. But anyways, it was about how the images that we use to represent war, and it was talking about how Twitter now allows for photographers to take extremely graphic pictures that depict war as gruesome and bloody, but depict the realities of war. And in past times, the editors might choose not to show them for whatever reason, that they might decide that, maybe they don't want to show a picture of a corpse on the front page. But now the internet allows, and so they would, in so doing, in making that choice, that editorial choice, they would be sanitizing the images that we have of war and make us think that these wars basically have no human cost. But now with online tools, that becomes impossible. We've essentially removed the gatekeeper role of the editor when it comes to news, or the art critic when it comes to the art world, and now it becomes sort of the consumer gets to decide what is worthy of our consumption rather than other people. And I guess that's kind of what you're saying, and I think that's a really cool idea that I hadn't put those connections together before.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that maybe also the way I guess to refine it a little bit, the way I see it working is that it allows for, I don't think that it necessarily democratizes what we see, but rather it distributes the power to like different people who might select different things. I mean, one of the things that you see on Twitter and some of the folks who write for Message, which is published on Medium, little Marshall McLuhan joke.
Well, you actually cut it out there, so I don't think anyone cut that joke.
So there's this article on, it's on Message, which is like a column. I don't know what to call things on Medium that are like curated, but that is specifically about, I guess, the like internal politics that are designed into social networks. And one of the things that you see on Twitter is that people with 5-figure followerships are, they have, I mean, obviously an outsized influence on the network, but also because like there are people have done like sort of statistical regressions on how many Twitter followers you need to like make a certain thing go viral, and that there's actually a threshold at which if you get retweeted by somebody with like a certain number of followers, like there's like there's like a correlation between the probability of that going like proper viral because it was like retweeted by somebody with that many followers. And so
right, it's just like it just increases your chances that somebody will pick it up. Like if you have a 5-figure follower account, at least one of those people will decide that this is the best thing ever and tweet off or whatever.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is that, like, whereas in the past, like, you had a photo page editor, in the present you have, like, high follower count power users on Twitter, and, like, they might or might not agree with you ideologically, right? And, like, I don't know, especially when it comes to images of violence, I always come back to, God, I'm, like, really just had a total brain fart. Susan Sontag, regarding the pain of others. The fact, in regarding the pain of others, Susan Sontag sort of points out that, like, images, especially images of suffering and images of violence, sometimes we believe them to be sort of, like, the ideological content is already baked into those images, but the fact of the matter is they're not, right? An image of a great example is, like, the image of the wounded World War I veteran can either be read as a sort of like celebration of the valor of the veteran, or a like sort of mournful reflection on the human toll of war. And it really depends on the sort of editorial content that accompanies it. And one of the nice things about a structure that allows super users who might be famous people, they might be regular people who just tweet funny shit all the time, is that there is a little more ideological variation. And I think that's what I think is really powerful about Twitter's ability to, like, I guess, king-make as far as like our sort of popular electronic imagery goes. That makes sense.
No. I think that makes total sense. And I think you're right that we do still have to recognize how built within Twitter are similar sorts of power structures or power hierarchies. It's not just like anybody with a Twitter account has equal amounts of power. If you've got 50,000 people following you, that is a different amount of influence than 5 people following you. And that's just inherent to the structure. But I think it also introduces other ways to have conversations that at least some have posited to be very radical and different from the ways that we traditionally conceive of what activism is. Like we've seen in the last year, a lot of think pieces that have posited that Twitter is not just a new tool to do the same thing, but is actually facilitating a new kind of activism. And so I don't know if you want to jump in on that or if you want me to start reading things from this essay that I think we're going to talk a little bit about.
Well, I just, like, there are a lot of things to start here. Well, I think that, one of the things that I've disagreed with a lot of think pieces about is the fact that Twitter is a tool, and it's like one of the tools in the toolbox. On a fundamental level, the nuts and bolts of what I actually had a really great conversation today. I had a meeting with Michael Badger, who works at Action Switchboard, which is a new project of the Yes Lab, about how a lot of people are building interesting platforms, but ultimately, like, it actually takes like nuts and bolts or skills to like make those platforms mean anything. And I think the same goes for Twitter. Like, using Twitter in a way that allows you to leverage a high follower count to actually get something done requires like strategic campaign thinking in much the same way that like organizing, folks to door to door or something also requires strategic campaign thinking.
Right. But I think it's a question of goals, right? So, these think pieces, I'm just going to present what the think pieces are saying so that we can have something to talk about. And I think you and I, Cayden, are probably more on the same page than the folks who wrote the think pieces. But one I'm pulling out in particular is Sophia Sewell's recent blog post, well, not so recent, it was from March, blog post called #NotYourAsianSidekick, Rethinking Protest Spaces and Tactics. And this was a piece that talked a little bit about how Twitter could be considered a radical tool that is reshaping what we think about in terms of activism. And so they said what Sewell is doing is positioning the idea of the conversation as a revolutionary, radical new way that was going to achieve activism that was going to replace the traditional protest. And so what she was suggesting was that hashtags can decentralize power, and so she says, quote, if we are increasingly using digital platforms as spaces to resist or negotiate power, could conversations be replacing protest? And so she suggests that the power of the conversation on Twitter was that it offers a multiplicity of ideas all combined together in a single hashtag. And so it creates a new kind of conversation which doesn't have to have a singular or coherent message. Instead, she says, quote, while Occupy Wall Street was criticized and dismissed for not having a singular coherent message, a key distinction between the kind of organizing and protest that happens on Twitter and the kind that happens in physical spaces is that Twitter allows, embraces, and encourages a plurality of messages. Hashtags allow messages to be both individual and collective. There is no need for a unifying message because a hashtag is designed to provide it itself. So that's the idea that Twitter is creating this new sort of way of thinking about activism, which is the creation of the conversation. And Sewell further posits that it's the conversation that is itself a radical act. So she concludes in her post, it is no longer to think of movements as having a specific endpoint or goal. The point is to keep moving and to create ripples in the process. So here's this idea of Twitter creating a form of protest that is the Twitter conversation in and of itself, and that it's radical and that it's completely different from the way that we traditionally conceive of protest movements, of messaging, of all of this, the idea of even creating influence or needing influence as a way to exert change in the digital sphere or in the offline world. So all of this would seem to go at odds with the idea of needing to have the super user who you can then capitalize on to create influence and all of this stuff. So what do you think about this idea? This is one of just, this is just representative of another idea that's out there regarding how Twitter is maybe changing the landscape of protest movements.
Well, I think that, you're right that there's a difference in goals and that it's important to talk about a difference in goals, but I also think that Sewell's reading of like the Twitter conversation as a sort of like revolutionary new act is a little bit romantic, right? And like romantic in the sense that one of the sort of like movement thinkers and people who think about not just like activism and such, but also like building social movements is Grace Lee Boggs, right? And one of sort of Grace's central formations is the conversation, has always been the conversation. I mean, the woman is a philosopher, she's a trained philosopher.
Yeah. And I think she's inspirational specifically because she's one of the few movement leaders who focuses on awareness building and consciousness raising over direct action.
Well, and I think that the two are not at odds, and the two have never been, actually.
No.
And I think that Grace herself would say that the two have never been really at odds, but that actually, like, to build real movements, the two always, and have always already had to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. I think the issue is that sometimes you have folks who prioritize one over the other, and one of the things that the internet has done is to re-emphasize the consciousness building aspect of being a revolutionary and allowed it to retake equal footing with the direct action work.
Well, I also always wonder if like what we're doing on the internet is in fact real consciousness raising.
I think it depends on the tool.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's the problem, right? Is we have this tool set that encourages a very specific kind of interaction, and you know, I'm not saying, you know, I hear a lot of people who say this who are not very dedicated Twitter users, but as you know, folks who have probably followed me on Twitter realize, like, I have a lot of very good Twitter friends who are only my friends on Twitter, and we have, like, deep and meaningful conversations in that space. But that's, I think, the exception rather than the rule, right? Like, the majority of my Twitter followers are not people that I interact with that like. And I think that there's this sort of idea that learning the language of social justice is the same as raising consciousness about social justice. And like, for me, the role of conversation in social movements and the kind of conversation that I understand is central to Grace's theory of social change is a kind of conversation that spirals outwards over the course of years, right? It's deep, it's rigorous, it is, I guess, like invested in a certain kind of relationship building that is actually sort of unusual online. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, because it certainly has happened to me a lot. But I also think that you know, and there's something qualitatively different about having, I guess, the kind of extended, intellectually rigorous kind of interaction.
Well, I think a couple of words that you picked out are things that just don't happen on Twitter. One of them is extended, and the other is intellectually rigorous. And I don't say that really to demean Twitter, even though it sounds like it does. But really, you know, what characterizes Twitter are, I mean, it's in the word. It's just these quick, brief interactions with people that are ephemeral, and then you interact with other people, and it's very fleeting. And that's just structurally in the way the tool is organized. So you can interact with someone theoretically and never ever interact with them ever again. And the context of that interaction is a series of short bursts of 140 character statements. And so just structurally, it's very, very difficult to have the kind of in-depth conversation that happens over the course of years that was happening in Grace Lee Boggs' living room on her couch, that was facilitated by books and you know, journal clubs and that kind of thing, where you were meeting regularly over the course of a long period of time and constantly self-reflecting and adapting your point of view. And then the third word I was going to say was self-reflective. Like, I think that when anything you're doing on Twitter is necessarily public, people can see it, people can interact with it and engage with it, and so you become sort of beholden to the things you say in the moment. Whereas I think there's something kind of nice about having those conversations in safer spaces where you have the freedom to have a a half-formed thought in your living room and never be beholden to having that be public and out in the world. And that allows you to sort of shape and evolve and change your thoughts and hone them over time. Whereas with Twitter, it's harder to do that because you're sort of committed to everything you tweet out.
Yeah, and as they say, the internet is forever.
Yeah. Like, I'm afraid of the things that I tweet online because I'm afraid that someone will find them like 6 months from now or a year from now and completely out of context use them or misinterpret them. And that can totally happen, and it does happen all the time with Twitter.
Yeah, and I mean, people have gotten wise to the fact that, like, if you screenshot something, you have evidence of somebody saying something, even if they've deleted it. And in some cases, that's used for, calling people out who do need to have their shit checked. But then, like, I also see it being used against people in ways that are, like, maybe they need their shit checked, but, like, do you really need to do this dogpile thing?
Well, I think, and actually you bring up a really important thing with the dogpiling thing in Twitter, and that's, I think that the last thing you could call a Twitter conversation is a safe space. If you say one thing, you do run the risk of having like a bazillion people come at you. And I've been on the receiving end of that a couple of times, and it's just completely overwhelming. I engaged a couple of these massive conversations and had, maybe 50, 100 people tweeting me all at once, disagreeing with something that I had written, and disagreeing with me because I hadn't finished my sentence yet. Like, it just didn't all fit in one tweet. So I went to the second tweet, and people were yelling at me about the first tweet. And I think that part of the issue is just because you only have 140 characters, it's really hard to express a complicated thought, or at least I find it really hard to express a complicated thought. Most of my tweets hit right up against that 140-character wall. And even when I manage to fit them in, I do find that my ideas get smaller because I'm forced to limit myself in that space. And even when you do it, you end up finding sometimes that your tweets are taken completely out of context. And I feel like that almost characterizes the Twitter conversation as well. Every tweet is standalone, and so they completely lack any form of context. They can't build upon one another because they can all be individually and separately retweeted and replied to.
Right, well, and that's actually exactly what makes Twitter a powerful tool for reporting, right? Is that, like, so, and I think that this is, like, one of the challenges of picking a platform and designing a platform, right? Is that, like, anything that you design for is necessarily always going to exclude some other function. And, like, a lot of times people will hack and, like, do things differently. And we've seen this a lot with Twitter also, because at this point it's a mature technology, right? People have started to use Twitter, and, like, mentions, for instance, even hashtags are things that came out of user behavior that then Twitter adapted to. One of the things that I've really appreciated recently is that you can now thread your tweets without mentioning yourself. So if you click the reply button to, like, something you've already tweeted, you can delete your handle. It'll still be threaded with the previous tweets. And there's like really, there's something about the orderly part of my brain that really enjoys that.
Well, I think that that's a much more conventional way of doing. I mean, like, that's basically just writing a multi-tweet, like a paragraph, which becomes something that's kind of like blogging. You're writing something longer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but I agree with you that being able to take individual tweets and retweet them out really does facilitate this sort of, like, amateur journalism, for lack of a better word, that Twitter facilitates and helps with. But it also really frustrates me because when I think about if the goal is this sort of romanticized consciousness building, and I do think Grace Lee Boggs' idea of revolution as evolution is sort of the gold standard of what we're trying to get at. What really frustrates me is for what I think of that, it requires multidimensional thought, it requires nuance, it requires framing and complexity. And yet I find that in Twitter those things are so lacking that it almost creates a conversation where context no longer becomes important. So I cited this Sophia Sewell blog post, and it really got my goat today because I read it pretty much for the first time today, and I'm actually quoted in it. And that's fine, that's not a big deal, but I was quoted out of context, which really pissed me off. So here Sewell is talking about, is basically defending the idea of the Twitter conversation as a form of activism. And this was written at a time when Twitter was getting a lot of flack for being, not a serious platform for Twitter activism. And so Sewell linked a post of mine that where I wrote, quote, "Not Your Asian Sidekick demonstrates that our ideas as Asian American feminists are out there under the surface waiting to be heard. But Not Your Asian Sidekick also proves that Twitter is the wrong place to have this conversation. 140 characters isn't enough to express a lifetime of experiences, both oppressive and uplifting, and to be able to do it in a place where it can be heard and taken seriously." Now, when I say that, when I'm quoted like that, it sounds as if I'm saying Twitter is just this not serious place where people are just joking around and not accomplishing real things. Except that the first part of that paragraph, literally the sentence before I was quoted in, I'm talking about how the Not Your Asian Sidekick conversation was great until it got subverted by trolls, and maybe the facility with which the conversation can be subverted by people who are looking to troll the conversation rather than people who are trying to take it legitimately and seriously is a weakness in the conversation that needs to be addressed structurally. So it was actually a way to say that the conversation was in and of itself incredibly important to have on Twitter, just we need to talk about how it can easily be subverted. And that really pissed me off because it made it sound as if I was saying something completely different than I wasn't. But I think it was also a really great example of how a single sentence taken outside of its paragraph then gets retweeted and reinterpreted as something completely not what I was trying to say. And if you read the full paragraph, it becomes clear that I'm actually saying the opposite of how I got quoted. But I think that's exactly symbolic of what happens to tweets all the fucking time.
Right. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this, taking things out of context thing is that, I mean, to me, one of the things that's been the most frustrating about this, quote-unquote, debate over the utility of Twitter as an activist tool, or whether or not hashtag activism is real activism, is that that has already framed the debate, right? It either is or it isn't. I've seen, this incredible dearth of thoughtful reflection on the actual utility of Twitter, and part of it is because I don't think a lot of people have done the actual work of studying what Twitter is good for. Somebody who has done an excellent job of studying what Twitter is good for is Zeynep Tufekci. She is a sociologist by trade, and she cut her teeth studying the Arab Spring. And certainly the Arab Spring is more akin to, I think, Ferguson or what's going on in Hong Kong now than Not Your Asian Sidekick. But at the same time, I think one of the things that I pull out of her work is that there needs to be, before we can make prognostications and write think pieces about the utility of Twitter or whether or not Twitter is an actual place for activism, we should be looking at, and this is going to sound so annoying, and I whenever these things come out of my mouth, I'm annoyed with myself. But honestly, metrics, right? And actually look at what people are using the thing for. Just creating heat and noise doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing work. And I think that it's really up in the air how to measure work that is done on social media, right? And
I almost wouldn't use the word metric. I would use connections and results almost as a way to talk. I come at this as a scientist's perspective, and I actually agree with you that there has been insufficient reporting of what I'm sure is a lot of data on how Twitter can be used to affect change. But, as a scientist, I always come at it as show me the numbers, show me the data, convince me of what this is good for and how this happened and all of that stuff. So I don't even think metrics is really the right term because that's just only one kind of data. But really I'd love to see the studies about how hashtags form and what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of doing in a way that can be quantified and really considered in an objective way rather than, I agree with you, I think that a lot of the proponents and the critics of Twitter have already just made a decision about, this is a great panacea tool that can accomplish all social change, or this is just a bunch of kids online talking to themselves in this very narcissistic millennial generation. And there's sort of no middle ground where people are willing to consider, maybe Twitter is a great tool, and maybe even we can reconsider this idea of conversation as a new form of protest. But we need to do that in a measured way, in an objective way, where we're able to recognize the flaws. Like, taking people's words out of context, I do not think is conducive to a decolonial mission or a decolonial goal. I think that people have been doing that to people of color and other marginalized people for a long fucking time, and to just replicate that through Twitter and to say, well, that's just a function of how we do things is just completely not radical.
Yeah, and I think that raises a great point, too, is that not sort of critiquing a platform or any piece of technology structurally is fundamentally not radical, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I like to point to as an example of a movement that has really sort of tried to grasp at the root of certain kinds of technologies that are about social control is feminism, right? And especially third wave feminism, thinking about how different structures of oppression work together, and also about what the technologies of gender, what that means, right? And being able to pull that sort of apart is fundamental to pulling apart the structures of oppression that interlock to create the society that we live in. And I think that often when we talk about new media, Twitter, Facebook, what have you, people forget that much like language, all these things are technologies that are designed by people to do particular kinds of work.
Right, and that a lot has been written and a lot of mental energy has been put towards the words that we use, in much the same way that we need to really emphasize putting mental energy towards the tools that we're using online, and not just use tools carelessly as if they are the solution to solve all problems.
Yeah, or simply accept that the tools that have been built are sort of delimit the boundaries of what's possible, right? I wrote a short piece on Elo because everybody was spilling ink about Elo 2 weeks ago. And I was like, thing that nobody is saying, and that is when we position Elo as the anti-Facebook, we have foreclosed on the sort of radical possibility of the internet, right? That if the only thing we have are social networks funded by venture capitalists, there's a very, you laugh because once you say it out loud, you see just how fucking absurd it is.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I have on our agenda that we're both looking at. Let's talk about Elo a little bit, because I completely agree with you. The idea that it's funded by venture capitalists, and then they're trying to sell us this manifesto where they're saying they're never going to collect or sell our personal information, read our posts, or map our social connections for profit is unethical. That's what they say. And they're never going to sell us ads, show ads, anything like that. And I think I have such a hard time with that, with buying into that as the anti-Facebook, as the revolutionary new tool, because at the same time, it's fucking, as you said, it's fucking paid for by venture capitalism.
Yeah.
And it sort of reminds me of the issues with Twitter, which we should get to in a second, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about Elo. I jumped on Elo mostly because I was afraid about losing the username. So I'm on Elo, and you guys can find me on Elo, but I can't figure it out. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it.
Yeah, I'm always delighted by new services because I can usually get my username of choice, which is either my first name, which is not available on Elo, or catachresis, which is a Greek term that is about, I guess, the original incomplete in any system of meaning. Right?
Yeah. And I'm usually lucky, nobody ever wants Reappropriate, so, I joined Twitter in 2009 or 2010, and nobody had that username yet. I was like, sweet!
Pre-Twitter activism.
Yeah.
So the thing that I think is interesting about Elo is, more than it's an unfinished tool that had a really great marketing moment than anything else, right? And I think you know, the point about venture capitalists is eventually they want to return their investment, and that's that's
somehow, like, I mean, I'm not saying they need to put their entire business plan online, but you gotta understand that saying that they're never going to sell ads and they don't have a for-profit motive. I mean, they have a for-profit motive. They have to. So
Yeah.
they are in some ways capitalizing on us.
They have said that the thing that they're trying is to see if users are willing to pay for premium features like a la carte.
Well, so I mean, on the one hand, we have a bazillion games where, you know, MMOs where people will pay to put a little hat on their avatar. So, you know, I could see it, but I don't know. I'm not someone who's ever bought a little hat for my cartoon avatar. So.
Right. I mean, in this way, it's a really worthwhile experiment, because I think that, especially like as far as mobile gaming is concerned, like microtransactions rule the day. The thing about Elo, and I think the reason that it got the press attention it did, is they released a shitty beta at the very moment that there was a kind of media shitstorm about Facebook policy. What's really interesting is that policy of Facebook's is not new. There was a blog post that was bouncing around during the like height of Facebook drag performer gate.
Is that its official name? Are we going to hashtag that?
Hashtag Facebook drag performer gate.
Yes.
Article that was floating around where Mark Zuckerberg is quoted to be saying that people who have multiple online identities are somehow unethical or untrustworthy. That blog post was from 2010. That blog post was literally 4 years old. And because things often like resurface through social media in the way that like all of a sudden everybody's posting it and it's gone viral again, people just had neglected to look at date, and because it fell in line with this narrative that was being told in the media about Facebook and their interest in deleting all of the personal accounts of drag performers. People were like, oh, you know, look at how fucked. And this shit has been going on since Facebook basically became a thing. That
right.
Like, it's always sort of, and if you think about pre-public Facebook, like when Facebook was still something that was for college kids, you had to use a .edu email address, which you could only get if you are an enrolled student in a university or a staff member, right? So it was always about using your real name. It was like been part of Facebook's policy from the beginning, but because there was this media shitstorm, Elo could jump in and be like, hey, if you're a drag performer, we won't delete your profile if you use a fake name. And then people started saying that there was some kind of like queer exodus to Elo, right? Which I was just like, oh god, like people are sort of
has there been, because you know I've been on Elo for a week now and I got 18 followers in the first day and then nothing. So like I don't see anybody on Elo.
My favorite thing about Elo is the ability to post inline GIFs, but that's just me. I mean, the point is that they seized a really great moment for launching their platform. The problem is their platform is not actually user ready.
No.
The way that their servers slowed down, the fact that you know, a lot of the things like just kind of don't work, or like the UX is really terrible. And I think that, you know, this points more than anything for me to the fact that like we live in a time when media literacy is more difficult, more complex than ever before, but also more important than ever before. And I think to me that's the lesson of Elo, and is maybe also the lesson that we draw from all this talk about Twitter activism is like we need a real nuanced discussion about media literacy. I feel like such a like crotchety old man for saying that, but like honestly, like as somebody who works with new media and who develops technology, like it like hurts my heart a little bit when people think that any one piece of technology is any kind of silver bullet for anything, right?
Right.
No matter if it's like a social network for drag performers or like the new place where like revolution is going to start. All of those things, like any sort of like a blanket statement like that, does it? I'm just like, but have you really thought about the technology and like what is it that you understand about the interaction of like technology, design, and like social power, right?
Well, so I can't remember if I had this conversation with you in our last podcast or if I had this conversation with Snoopy, my boyfriend, James, my boyfriend. So stop me if I had this conversation and you're like, I've heard this. But I actually think that the age that you joined the internet in general actually shapes whether or not you have that kind of media literacy because, you joined, I remember you talked about you joined during GeoCities time, and I did as well. That was a time when I think there was a lot more experimentation about what was possible on the internet and how we could connect with one another and communicate with one another and how we could capitalize on those tools for political goals at the time. So, in 2000, 2001, we saw the early social media, which was, at least for the Asian American community, AsianAvenue.com. We had message boards, forum boards that were like BB code style. We had like Reddit, blogs were a thing at the time. And so we didn't just have sort of your one or two go-to tools. Everybody was sort of a pioneer of the internet. And we were all sort of trying to figure out different ways that we could use all of these sort of prepackaged tools, but also how we might hack those tools and come up with new ways to present information. And so I feel like if you sort of came of age during that time, you were sort of implicitly forced to be a little bit more thoughtful about what your tools are like. And that's why I think I gravitate towards blogging. It's not just because, it's an easy, free thing that I did at the time. Like, I'm a conscientious blogger. I'm a conscious blogger. I chose this medium because of all of the possible tools available. This is the one I think best allows for the same consciousness building that you were talking about with Gracefully Blogs. But I wonder if maybe I'm not sure if it's because now everybody is online, or maybe we've sort of seen at the same time so many more users online. We've seen a sort of a movement away from self-building or individual building of individual sites towards joining larger conglomerate sites, or what it is. But I feel like we've lost that thoughtfulness about the tools, and we've lost that experimentation about tools. So now not everyone is a developer. I think. Right.
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I feel like we've sort of maybe talked about that sort of.
Yeah. So I apologize if I said that like last time.
So I think that actually that move away from this like much more anarchic, like people can like make random shit thing, towards social networks is it's like very clearly a function of yes, you're right, more people getting online. But it's also a function of the fact that as more people got online, capital was like, oh, all the eyeballs are there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to then get more people online, so it's this sort of self-reinforcing cycle, in order to then get more people online, you have to build services that are even more easy to use.
Right.
People are always like, oh, my 4-year-old can use an iPad. It's because it was designed for a 4-year-old to use it, right? Like,
right. It's got one button, guys, and if you keep tapping the blinky thing, it'll do something. And which I say that, and yet facetiously, I like just bought this iPod. This is a brand new iPod, and I spent the first day that I had it not being able to figure it out, even though I already own an iPod. So I could not figure out how to turn the freaking thing on. So with all, I'm poking a little bit of fun at myself. Like, these things are not that intuitive, apparently. But like, yeah, in general, like, you're right. The things are designed now for people to be able to use them with this one-touch buttons, and everything is supposed to be really intuitive. You don't need an instruction manual to do anything anymore. But then you have these services, like, for example, Twitter, which takes so much of the power away from individual users. You can no longer really customize how things look or how things are presented to people anymore, because you're sort of constrained to what someone else's conception of how we should communicate with one another is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that the sort of it's very clear that the driving force behind that is capitalism, right? Is that, like, in order to define and expropriate value from these like emerging markets, capital needs to figure out how to control those markets. Whereas with like GeoCities, I could literally sign up for an infinite number of accounts and start just like making shit, like strew itself across the internet wildly.
Yeah.
That not so. It's not actually, like, Facebook doesn't get a value add out of you making a second account. It actually, like, fucks with their whole business model for you to have a second account. And I think what's actually more insidious than anything else is the fact that the emergence of that as the paradigm of how we interact with the internet means that we are all sort of socialized into like assuming the internet is always going to be sort of that ECT, right? And to me, that's very frightening. Like, as somebody who like sometimes does work at the level of code to like build technology, I'm like really concerned about what that means for us.
Well, so I posed this question to Twitter, and I got one question for today, or one comment for today. At Ordacy, whose username is BivouacOLantern, which I think is awesome. I asked Twitter whether or not Twitter itself, Twitter activism, could be considered radical, considering the for-profit motive of Twitter or Facebook or anything. And at Ordacy, said Twitter activism is reclaiming a capitalist space. We operate within reality while trying to change it. And I think that that's a nice tie into what we're talking about, which is this idea that we have this for-profit motive, but within that, radical activists are trying to still create change. But at the same time, what you and I are saying is that we can't do that without also recognizing that we're within this, capitalist sphere, this capitalist environment, where even as we try to be radical, we try to dismantle systems of power, we are at the same time perpetuating that business model. At the exact same time, we are allowing these places to use us to make money. And one thing that I've suggested, again, I can't remember if I said this last time or not, was that the way to get around that is to go back to that sort of early Final Frontier, Wild West moment of the internet, where users weren't just using large conglomerate services, but were actually creating and developing our own spaces. Because we all still have the tools available to us. Creating a blog, you can circumvent every aspect of a large corporation, and just register your own domain, install open source code, and make your own blog from scratch. And that, I think, is the truly decolonial act.
Well, I mean, the problem is right. There's no social or economic transaction in the current moment that is not fraught, right? Even if you do that, I mean, you still have to buy some kind of hardware. Like, assuming that you don't go to like a certain host provider and like buy hosting, you then also have to like find hardware and like have like an internet that is up all the time.
Yes, I mean, you're right. I'm saying that and I'm romanticizing it a little bit, but there's so much space between setting up your own server and setting up an account on Twitter where you use their server. Like, I feel like you can create degrees of moving away from this capitalist environment and try and create your own space that doesn't buy into that model. And the problem is that we haven't truly interrogated, or for some reason we've rejected that entirely. We're even seeing individual blogs are moving away from being individual blogs and are being consumed by these larger blogging services. Right. And a monopolization, essentially, of what used to be very individualized, self-directed blogging.
Well, and I think that this is ultimately the challenge of social media, right? Is that, and the reason that it's so hard to compete with Facebook is because that's where the people are. And that the quality of the interaction that we have come to be interested in finding on the internet has changed. And I think that on a very fundamental level, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but the question is not what can we go back to, but rather how can we build something for the future that does something differently. And I know a lot of people in the sort of like Facebook LO blow up were like, ooh, diaspora. And like, diaspora is awesome. It takes an incredible amount of technical know-how to set up a node. I actually tried once. It was very difficult.
To set up a social network?
Yeah. So the way that diaspora works, and diaspora is really neat because the way that it's sort of been designed is that anybody can set up a node, anybody with a threshold of technical expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And you can register as a user on any node, and then regardless of what node you have joined Diaspora on, you can be friends with people on any other node,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that the server space, everything has been decentralized, so it's sort of like up to individuals and organizations to run their own nodes. And I think that like that model, like it's a very interesting experiment in that model, because it, I think, points to a potential future where those things are possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is, of course, that I mean, there are two issues, right? The first of which is developing software like that is incredibly labor intensive and incredibly costly. I guess the subset of that is making, like, shipping a version of that that's easy enough for somebody with like my mild to moderate level of technical expertise is able to install is like actually a Herculean effort. And then the second issue is the question of how do you get folks there. And I
To
think
some degree, I almost think that's the bigger question, because I feel like if you create more access to that kind of tech, not like, yeah, like to that kind of technology where it becomes something that's widely available, you will find the people with the kind of expertise to install it who are not beholden to something like Facebook. Like, the people with the skills are out there, or you will learn it.
I mean, I don't know. Like, it's really hard to say, like, if there's a cart, if there even is a cart and horse situation here, merely because in order to want to install, like, create an installation of Diaspora, you need to, like, know it. You need to know that it exists. You need to have the technical expertise to do it. You have to have the access to the infrastructure to do it, right? Like, there's like, quite a high sort of, if we think of this like as an organizer's ladder of engagement, like that's the top fucking rung of that ladder of engagement. But so in order to be motivated to go there, you need to have, I mean, the fact that like me with a collective of sort of activist technologists couldn't get to that rung on the ladder, I think says a lot about the difficulty there, even though we're highly motivated to do it, right?
Right.
And the other issue being that once we had it set up, we're like, okay, we can invite our friends, but like,
now what?
It is about a sort of like critical mass of people.
Yeah, and that was what I was trying to get at. Like, you can, I think that the technical obstacles are things you can overcome. Like, you know, if we remember, you know, the early 2001 again, back in the day, the idea of installing a MySQL database on your server, having access to that, having access to PHP, was not trivial. Like, that was the kind of thing that most people who are coding in HTML thinking about diggity are like, oh my god, I need to write an if loop or something like that, or an if statement. Like, that's a major big deal. But we've come so far from that point that now either we all have rudimentary PHP skills if we are, you know, an amateur blogger, or we have one-click installations, and people have essentially removed the need to be a developer from most people who are self-hosting. So, like I said, I think the technical issues are not as big a deal as trying to find ways to circumvent these behemoths like Facebook, while recognizing that the draw of something like social media is a critical mass or a threshold of people. Like, the problem with Elo right now is, the idea is nice. It's a butt ugly social media site, but you know, it could be a useful anti-Facebook if it wasn't clearly for profit. But there's nobody on there, so there's no draw to stay on there and put up with the craptastic, non-functioning buttons. Like, you need to figure out a way to pull people away from what is the social media mainstream into these spaces that are perhaps more radical, but also harder to establish because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, but I also think that the reason that a lot of those technical skills have evolved is because there was a lot of money that was invested in, for instance, WordPress software very early on, right? Like, the amount of effort that was put into developing WordPress and making it easy to install is non-trivial. I think that, you know, the issue, we can't separate those two things. And that's, you know, a lot of people say that the issue is like moving to something like Elo, but getting people to stay is hard. And when you're then also talking about asking people to maintain their own shit that's already like not as easy to use, where like their mom isn't on Facebook, you know, like I don't know that there's going to be something that replaces Facebook for that reason. Facebook's going to die out as, and even Twitter may die out as a sort of like hub of intellectually exciting conversation because of the oversaturation thing. Like, but my mom is not going to use that. You know what I mean? Like,
you don't know. 5 years from now, your mom could be.
I'm saying right now. I'm saying like in terms of like its function. Like I talk to my mom on Facebook. You know what I mean? And I think that a couple of commentators have pointed this out, that like maybe the future of the internet is not about a Facebook killer, but rather about refragmenting the internet, right? And I think that might be what we're really talking about, is the fact that as the internet, I guess like has been consolidated into these tiny empires. And you see this with like Google, right, as like a mega provider of basically every internet service, for either free or like a very reasonable cost given the quality of the product. There's going to be a refragmentation. There's got to be a refragmentation, because one corporation can't just own the internet. It's not like I think that there's like a number of levels on which that can and will be halted.
Cayden, not for lack of trying. There are many corporations that are trying to own the internet.
Google is hella good at owning a lot of the internet, right? But I think,
besides that, we've gotten into the whole Comcast, Time Warner Cable thing, right?
Right.
Like,
but I think that, like, in terms of services that people use to connect to each other on the internet, you know, there's always going to be people building interesting things and like luring people onto different platforms for different reasons. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I think about also is this sort of like rise of the distributed organizing petition platform. So the way that MoveOn has changed the way it does its petitions, or the way that Change does its petitions, it's like people don't join Change to talk to their mom, but people join Change to start and sign petitions, which is like actually a very specific function. They may take that petition back to Facebook to ask their mom to sign it.
But at the same time, we've seen that petition software also deconsolidate or fragment out. So now, you know, multiple services are hosting similar petition type software, so you don't have to go to MoveOn, or you don't have to go to Change in order to create or host or even generate an entire petition creating platform. And it's the same idea with Kickstarter. At one time it was just Kickstarter, and now you've got hundreds of these kinds of, you know, mini fundraising kinds of services. And I think that that's a good thing. You know, the problem with Twitter and Facebook is that we've lost the options to buy out from the for-profit motive that these services have. And part of the consequence of that is that we've stopped questioning what these services are really doing, how they're really taking advantage of us. So I think that you're right, that we're moving towards this fragmentation of the internet, and I think that that is not just a good thing, it's a necessary thing for evolving social justice questions online. We need to have the choice to not opt in.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble really comes where, you know, as an organizer, what you want to do is go where your folks are, organize them, and all of the folks are on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr. Like, that's where the folks are.
You know what we need is we need Asian Avenue back. And on that note,
Really Rising Project. I just want to tonight. We're bringing back.
We're bringing back Asian Avenue. On that note, it's been an hour. I'm gonna call.
Oh my god. The internet.
I say that actually never having had an AsianAvenue.com account, actually. Like,
I actually think, well, I mean, part of it was like I really didn't really think about my racial identity until Actually, quite.
Actually, I lie. I think I started one and posted like one post that was like, "Hi, I'm at Reappropriate. Come see me there." But yeah, okay, we're bringing back Nation Avenue. Y'all heard it here first. On that note, I'm gonna call it and say thank you, Cayden, for a really phenomenal conversation. It's been just about an hour, and so I don't want to keep us both longer than that. Because I know today we both were talking earlier before the episode that we're both incredibly busy. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about this conversation. I actually thought it was really fun and really phenomenal. We covered a lot of ground, and I hope you feel that same way too.
Yeah, totally. As always, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I just like shooting. I like talking about my opinions about the internet. I think that is like really somebody who's like of the internet is like I just want to shoot the shit about my opinions about it all day.
And I'm a clear blogger partisan who gets really frustrated because I feel like bloggers are getting a really short end of the stick. We somehow became the mainstream online, and like I remember when we had our cowboy hats on and we were like, we are the like anarchists of the internet, and now suddenly we're the man. And that really pisses me off. So but yeah, I really appreciate the conversation. Hopefully, maybe you know, as things come up, we will be able to find more things to talk about the you know, all of these issues, because I feel like we have great conversations, and then I think back on them and think about things that we could have talked about. So, but thank you again. Is there any other 18MR things you want to plug? Maybe plug the voter registration thing again, just to make sure that everybody is voting.
I mean, part of the reason that my life is so chaotic right now is that we are exactly 1 month away from the midterm elections. And, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, well, like, you know, voting's not radical because you're, like, giving power to the system that, like, governs us. And I'm like, yeah, I'm the anarchist to get that. But at the same time, like,
yeah, no, I don't get. I'm not there. I think everybody should be fucking voting. Just
oh yeah, well,
seriously, go vote.
Here's the thing, right? Is like I think there is a philosophical argument for abstaining, but at the same time, I think it's also racist to not vote because we need to avoid as much death as possible in the interim as we supplant the system. I'm not the just tear it down kind of anarchist. Irresponsible. The people who get screwed in that situation are like black and brown people and like queer people and people with disabilities, and I'm not down for that.
And I'm also going to point out that from the perspective of the system, abstaining conscientiously from voting and being disenfranchised is indistinguishable. So
that's true. And people fought and died for your right to vote, so don't fuck it up.
Okay, that just turned into like an eat your vegetables kind of moment. On that note, thank you so much, Cayden, for joining me. And to all of our viewers, I think I know who you are who watched us live, so thank you for joining us and thank you for retweeting us. And I just want to remind all my viewers that you can, if you didn't live stream this episode, you have a chance to download it tomorrow. You can do that through YouTube. Through the website, reappropriate.co, you can get an MP3 version. You can also subscribe to me on the iTunes Store. And you should tune in next week this time when I will be joined by the wonderful ladies of the Ladies of the Round Table podcast, where we will be talking about something having to do with feminism, geek culture, and gaming, although the specific topics has not been ironed out yet. But the podcast episode will be next Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thanks again, Cayden, for joining me, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. See you next week.
Bye.